Excellent. So I was tasked during the national risk assessment and here in this webinar to discuss direct and indirect economic impacts. When we think about disasters, we think of sort of three types of economic impact. The immediate, the direct impact on assets, and the assets can be, broadly speaking, of course, economic assets like infrastructure or houses and so on. But of course, can also be people, and I apologize for the insensitivity of calling people assets. But from an economic perspective, of course, they are. And then later on, what would be the indirect impact that Sarah already referred to a few times in her much broader overview of the national risk assessment. So the indirect effects and what we highlight in this in this part of the guidelines is the fact that these indirect effects we also need to think about the length of time in which these persist. So typically, when we think of when we do national risk assessments or any kind of risk assessments, almost always the focus is on the immediate direct impact, on the impact on the stock of capital that is lost, on the stock of assets, of what people will be on mortality and morbidity and so on. And it's much less common to see careful thinking about the indirect and possibly the permanent impact. So one purpose we want to do in this piece is to highlight the need to also think not only about the stocks, but also longer term. And just in terms of the stocks, this is just a tabulation that was done by UNISDR. And here you see that the stock of loss associated with disasters, by far most of it is in high-income countries. These are the, well, I believe they're gray. I'm not sure, but I'm colorblind. So forgive me if the color is wrong. But the left, sort of the color on the left, is most of the loss is in high-income countries. But of course, we know that the most dramatic impact is in low-income countries. And that is because the loss is as a share of wealth is much higher in low-income countries, and you can see that by the other color. So if by far most of the losses in high-income countries, actually in low-income countries, as a share of wealth, the economic losses are maybe 20 times as high. So one needs to account not only for the dollar term, the dollar amount of loss, and Sarah mentioned that we can always count everything in dollars, but actually a dollar in a poor country is worth a lot more than a dollar in a rich country. And we need to remember that. And this is also true, a dollar in a poor region is worth a lot more than a dollar in a wealthy region. A dollar for a poor household is worth a lot more than a dollar for a rich household. So we need to think about exactly where those assets are lost, and what is the meaning of those asset losses for the people who suffer that loss, whether it's the government, the local government, organizations, households, etc. Okay, but what we do want to, I think, emphasize more is the indirect impact. When we think of indirect impact, we typically think of sort of this kind of scenarios where if the line is you see the baseline trend, and then at some point there is a disaster, we typically think of four possible scenarios. Two fairly optimistic ones. One is that the disaster leads to some kind of a better future, what we call the creative destruction. But possibly a disaster does lead to a sort of a slowing down, but later with a build back better scenario, we end up at a higher trajectory than the baseline. And then there is a recovery to trend, so we we do experience some slowdown, but eventually we go back to trend, and and sort of the most pessimistic scenario where we never recover back to trend. Now, if you look at the actual experience post-catastrophic events, you observe that actually these two scenarios that are highlighted are much more common. And it's very, very difficult to find examples, definitely not of creative destruction, optimistic scenarios, but even build back better is usually, not always, but usually more of an aspiration rather than something that we really observe happening after disasters. So if these scenarios are not really realistic in most cases, then we need to really understand whether we are at a recovery back to trend and how long it takes to recover back to trend, because if it takes a much longer period of time, then of course the indirect loss is much higher. And of course, if there is no recovery, then potentially the indirect losses are humongous. If this slowdown persists for years, decades, and maybe generations, then the impact of this event is so much higher, so that our need to invest more, as Sahar already said, to invest more now in prevention and risk reduction is that much greater. So this is just a case study that I was involved in some years ago, and here we looked at Kobe after the earthquake in 1995. Now, if you observe what happened in Kobe, the Kobe experienced this no recovery scenario. So this sort of pessimistic scenario at the bottom there. Kobe never really fully recovered from the. This is our conclusion. Other people have other conclusions, but at least from our observation, Kobe never recovered. 20 years later, Kobe has still not recovered from the earthquake. So the permanent loss in income that the region experienced, and a lot of that lost income moved elsewhere, so moved to other regions in Japan and moved to other countries. Then, of course, we understand that the impact on Kobe is that much higher than the immediate loss of stock of housing and the mortality and the morbidity, most of which, at least in terms of the housing, most of which was rebuilt within 3-4 years after the event. So the point we are saying is one needs to focus not only on the stocks, but focus on the flows as well, focus on the short term and what happens in the long term. Think of different scenarios of what might be the kind of bottlenecks or decision points which will lead you from one scenario to another, and pay a lot more attention to the poor are much more vulnerable. They are also much more vulnerable to these long-term impacts. So we are much more likely to see these long-term adverse declines in poor regions than in richer regions, or in poor countries than in richer countries. There are, other kind of schisms within countries that might be also playing a role, and ethnic divisions, religious divisions, disadvantaged minorities of other sorts, and all of these will be more exposed not only to this immediate impact, but also to the long-term recovery. They may have more difficulty in finding the resources to recover quicker, and all of that needs to be thought of ahead of time. Regional differences are also important. Now, regional differences can be associated with poverty or things like that, but they can also be associated, for example, with different sectors. So different sectors might be much more vulnerable to these long-term impacts than others. Agriculture, at least some types of agriculture, can recover very quickly, depending on the kind of infrastructure you need for agriculture, depending on the crops, etc. Tourism is potentially a very vulnerable sector, again, depending on exactly what is driving tourism and what is and what's the perception as a result of the event of what the future will hold in that region. There are also issues with links to other regions and how the affected region, the regions that you think will be affected by this specific event, is linked to other regions in terms of its economic activities. What would be the spillovers to other regions? So potentially, if you have a region that is extremely important in one specific sort of chain in the supply chain, and that region is affected by a disaster, then that impact can affect a lot of other regions as well. We saw that, for example, in Japan after the tsunami, where just maybe one example is that because of the nuclear event, we saw a general decline in the supply of electricity in Japan. So difficulty in electricity supply in Japan that had an impact all over the eastern part of the country. Some of it very far away from the disaster location. And we in that instance, we also need to think about trade and both international trade, and the way that the regions that are affected are linked to international trading, international trading relationships, but not only international trade, but also domestic trade, and what is the role for various affected regions in producing and trading goods and services nationally and internationally. So we need to understand these in order to be able to be better prepared. So for example, if we know that a certain region is incredibly important because it provides a crucial link in the supply chain, then we can build some redundancy in those supply chains so that the impact on that, if the region is indeed hit by an event, the impact on supply chains and therefore on other regions will not be as severe. The amount of we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about recovery, but one thing we do know is that the more financial resources you have for recovery, the better the recovery will be. So one needs to think carefully ahead of time in these national risk assessments of what kind of financial resources will you have available should you be hit by a disaster. And those financial resources can originate from insurance arrangements, and these insurance arrangements can be both by individuals, by regions, by governments, by central governments, and so on. Or it can be other source of financial resources. It could be contingency agreements with, for example, multilateral organizations like the World Bank. It could be various other financial instruments that provide risk sharing, like cat bonds, catastrophic bonds. Or it can be just reliance on remittances or aid flows. The more we know how much financial resources will be available should an event occur, the better we can plan for that event and do the risk assessment of should we plan for making more financial resources available. So, for example, should we participate in insurance arrangements, of which there are plenty of examples, like the sovereign insurance arrangements that, for example, the Caribbean countries had, and that recently a lot of them needed after this hurricane season in the region. And last, we want to think of government capacity. Government capacity is not financial capacity, but just the ability of the government to mobilize once a disaster hits, so that government is able to respond and make sure that that we end up not in this no recovery trajectory, but at the very least we recover back to trend and potentially even big back better. Two last things I want to point out is that confidence is extremely important. So the way that the affected community, the government and so reacts to the disaster is incredibly important in the long term, because that based on that you will build the confidence in the future, and we know that confidence matter a lot for economic trajectories. So if we can um, will be. So we need to plan ahead in terms of where are we vulnerable in terms of this loss of confidence. And last, we need to think about what is the aim of policy in the recovery period, and what is a good recovery, and where do we want recovery to head. Um, because occasionally, you know, recovery doesn't necessarily means it has to go back to what it was before. Potentially, you know, there will be some loss of population, but maybe the government anyway wanted that concentration of population in that region to reduce. So maybe that's not a bad outcome. On the other hand, in some other instances, you may find that this is exactly what you don't want. So thinking ahead of time of what kind of recovery trajectories do you want to see will better help will assist in the risk assessment.